When I first pulled into the quiet streets of Maple Ridge, it felt like stepping into a postcard. The houses were perfectly spaced, with neatly trimmed lawns and flowers in full bloom. A few kids played catch in their front yards, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries as they walked their dogs. It was the kind of suburban neighborhood people dream of, a place where everyone knows your name, and the days seem to pass without a care. After years of living in apartments and constantly moving around, I couldn't believe I finally found a place to settle down. This was home. My name is Jake, and I'm a freelance graphic designer who works from home. The opportunity to own a house was something I'd worked hard for, and when I found this charming little property on the edge of Maple Ridge, I couldn't resist. The house was a modest 2-story, with a sprawling backyard that seemed perfect for everything I had in mind. Gardens, a small vegetable plot, a few chickens roaming around, maybe even a little fire pit for the cooler months. It was the kind of peaceful life I had longed for. Moving into the neighborhood, I was immediately taken by its serenity. The lawns were pristine, and the homes were all in perfect condition, their owners clearly proud of their well-maintained spaces. The air smelled fresh, and the gentle rustling of the trees provided a calming background to the occasional chirping of birds. I pictured weekends spent tending to my garden, maybe hosting BBQs with friends under the stars, and enjoying the simplicity of suburban living. But like any dream, there was an underlying catch. Maple Ridge wasn't just any neighborhood. It was governed by the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. And from the moment I arrived, I could sense their presence like a shadow lurking in the corner of my new life. Everyone spoke about them with a certain reverence, or perhaps fear was the right word. Just make sure you get approval before doing anything to your property. My neighbor Carol warned me on my first day. The HOA doesn't mess around. She was a sweet woman with a hearty laugh, but her warning was clear, and I quickly realized the HOA was not something to take lightly. From the way the residents talked, it seemed like the HOA had a hand in every aspect of life in Maple Ridge. Landscaping, fence heights, the type of siding you could put on your house, even the color of your front door. At first, I brushed it off. How strict could an HOA really be? I had lived in other communities before, and while they had their rules, they weren't exactly on top of every little detail. I figured if I kept my yard neat, didn't build anything ridiculous, and followed the basics, I'd be fine. What could go wrong? I only just arrived after all, and didn't plan on doing anything out of the ordinary. That was, of course, until the HOA decided to show me just how wrong I was. It didn't take long before I met Mrs. Grayson. She was the neighborhood's unofficial HOA enforcer, a woman who seemed to take immense pleasure in making sure everyone followed the rules to the letter. Her house was the most pristine in the entire neighborhood, with manicured bushes, a perfectly straight walkway, and a garden that looked like it was plucked straight out of a gardening magazine. If there were an award for best kept yard, Mrs. Grayson would have won it every year, and I'm sure she made it her life's mission to ensure everyone else's yard was just as immaculate. I first saw her on a bright Saturday morning when I was out front planting a few shrubs around my mailbox. Mrs. Grayson was walking down the street with a clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning each house like a hawk searching for prey. She nodded at me, a forced smile on her face, before stopping to stare at my mailbox, which was slightly off-center. "Your mailbox," she began, her voice dripping with passive-aggressive sweetness, "could use a little work. It's supposed to be aligned exactly with the driveway. You know, the HOA has very strict guidelines about this kind of thing." She didn't wait for me to respond before walking off to the next house, clipboard still in hand. I stood there, blinking, unsure of how to respond. I had just moved in, and already it felt like I was being scrutinized. But at that moment, I brushed it off. It was a minor thing, right? I adjusted the mailbox and let it go. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Grayson made her presence known in the most peculiar ways. If I was out in the yard mowing the lawn, she would stroll by and casually mention how I needed to keep my grass cut to a particular height. If I trimmed the hedges, she'd stop and remind me that they couldn't be any higher than 4 feet. When I replaced the garden lights, she made sure to point out that the new ones were too modern and didn't fit the neighborhood's traditional aesthetic. At first, I thought she was just being nitpicky, but soon it became clear that Mrs. Grayson wasn't just a stickler for the rules. She was the HOA's self-appointed enforcer, and she had an eye for anything that didn't perfectly fit the neighborhood's narrow standards. The other neighbors, it seemed, had either given in or didn't want to rock the boat, so they complied with her demands. But something told me I wasn't going to be that easy to intimidate. I wasn't about to change every little thing about my house to please her, and I certainly wasn't going to live my life in constant fear of breaking an unwritten rule. I had done my research when I bought the place, and I knew the HOA was strict, but I never imagined it would come to this. That's when I realized the truth. Mrs. Grayson had a kind of power in this neighborhood that went beyond her obsessive need for perfect lawns and pristine properties. She had influence, real influence, thanks to her role with the HOA. And it wasn't just about appearances anymore. Mrs. Grayson, it seemed, was preparing to take me on in a much bigger way than I ever expected. I was about to learn that the HOA wasn't just some minor inconvenience. It was a force that could make or break your life in this neighborhood. And with Mrs. Grayson leading the charge, I knew I was going to have to be prepared for a fight. It wasn't long before I received my first official letter from the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, a thick envelope that felt like it was filled with judgment rather than paper. My heart sank when I saw the return address. I had been warned that the HOA could be aggressive with their enforcement, but I wasn't expecting it so soon. The letter was dated just 2 weeks after Mrs. Grayson's comment about my mailbox, and the contents were far from friendly. It started with a formal greeting and quickly got to the point. I had violated HOA regulations by not aligning my mailbox properly with the driveway. The letter outlined the exact dimensions it should have been, listing off a dozen specific measurements and restrictions. And, of course, there was a bold reminder that failing to comply would result in a fine, $100 for the first offense, with additional fees for every subsequent violation. I sat there stunned as I read through the letter multiple times, trying to wrap my head around the absurdity of it all. I had barely lived here for a month, and already I was being fined for something as trivial as a mailbox being slightly off-center. The whole thing felt like overkill, especially when compared to the other houses in the neighborhood, some of which had mailboxes that were just as far off as mine. I walked outside to look at the mailbox, still sitting where I had left it. It didn't seem like a big deal to me, but to the HOA, it clearly was. This wasn't just about a mailbox, it was about control. They had a rule, and they expected everyone to follow it, no matter how insignificant it seemed. To them, I was just another resident who needed to fall in line. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't going to be the last time I had to deal with them. I wasn't someone who took well to being pushed around, especially for something so minor. I understood rules. Heck, I worked with deadlines and standards every day in my career. But this felt like an attack on my independence. I had made it clear from the beginning that I wasn't going to let anyone tell me how to live, especially not for something as silly as a mailbox. But now I had an official warning, and I couldn't afford to ignore it. I knew I needed to respond. I wasn't going to be another resident who bent to the HOA's will without question. No, I was going to fight back, and I was going to start with a mailbox. I took a deep breath and made a plan. I'd align the mailbox to their exact measurements, and then I'd write back stating my case. I wanted them to know that I wasn't just some clueless homeowner. They'd messed with the wrong person. As I went back inside to grab the tools needed to fix the mailbox, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The HOA had a hold on this neighborhood, but I wasn't about to let them dictate every aspect of my life. I was prepared to stand my ground, and I had a feeling the battle was far from over. Just a few days after I fixed the mailbox, I thought the issue was resolved. The mailbox was now perfectly aligned, standing proud and in compliance with every nitpicky detail the HOA had outlined. But, of course, I was wrong to think that would be the end of it. The HOA wasn't done with me just yet. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it happened. I had just returned from work, pulled into the driveway, and was about to grab my mail when I saw a car slowly pull up in front of my house. The vehicle was unfamiliar, a black sedan with tinted windows. I didn't recognize the make, but what caught my attention were the two figures stepping out of the car. Both were dressed in sharp, businesslike attire, holding briefcases, and wearing the same smug expression. Before I could even ask who they were, one of them flashed a laminated card with the HOA logo. The man introduced himself as Gregory Chase, the HOA compliance officer, and his partner as Samantha Rhodes, the HOA enforcement coordinator. They were there, they said, to conduct a routine inspection. I was immediately on edge. I had complied with their demands regarding the mailbox, so why were they here? Was this some sort of intimidation tactic? Did they really need to send two people to inspect my property after a simple mailbox adjustment? Good afternoon, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I've already addressed the mailbox issue, just like your letter requested. It's aligned with the driveway now, just as the regulations outlined. Gregory's eyes narrowed, and he exchanged a glance with Samantha. "That's what we thought," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. "But we're here to check the overall compliance of your property. We've received several complaints from your neighbors." I blinked in surprise. Complaints? From whom? I hadn't done anything else to disrupt the neighborhood's supposed peace and harmony, but it didn't matter. Apparently, the HOA was still determined to find something wrong. "What kind of complaints?" I asked, feeling the heat of frustration rise within me. "Mainly about the aesthetics," Samantha replied, her tone crisp and almost clinical. "There are concerns about the hedges in your backyard, the size of your porch lights, and even the type of paint you've used on the trim. You see, the HOA has guidelines for everything. We must make sure they are strictly followed." I stood there for a moment, digesting what she had just said. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It seemed like they were now looking for any tiny thing to accuse me of. I didn't even know where to begin in defending my decisions. A few hedges and some porch lights? Was this really what I had gotten myself into? I tried to keep my cool, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. "So you're telling me that I violated the rules because I have some hedges and lights?" I asked, barely able to hide the disbelief in my voice. "Exactly," Gregory said, still giving me that irritatingly smug look. "We'll be taking a few photos for our records, and if we determine that you're in violation of HOA standards, we'll issue another fine." He paused, looking me over. This could result in further penalties if not corrected. This wasn't just about aesthetics or some small violation. It was starting to feel like an all-out campaign against me. The worst part? They hadn't even warned me about the so-called complaints. They had decided to inspect my property on a whim, showing up uninvited and demanding compliance with arbitrary standards. I tried to stay calm, but my patience was wearing thin. "I'll gladly correct anything that is truly out of line," I said through clenched teeth, "but you need to understand something. You can't keep coming into my property and treating me like I'm breaking some huge law just because I'm new here." Samantha gave me a condescending smile. "Don't worry, Mr. Cooper. We're just doing our jobs. We'll be sure to report back on everything we find." Before I could protest further, they started snapping photos of the exterior, making notes on their clipboards. It felt like I was under a magnifying glass, and every inch of my home was being scrutinized. The feeling of being overwhelmed set in, but I knew I couldn't back down. I wasn't just going to let them trample all over me, not without a fight. As they left, they handed me a business card, but not a word of apology for the unannounced visit. "We'll be in touch," Gregory said, before they both climbed into the sedan and drove off, leaving me standing in my front yard, fuming. The HOA had now escalated the situation. It wasn't just about a minor violation anymore. It was about control, and they seemed determined to maintain that control at all costs. I couldn't just sit idly by and let them walk all over me. They had crossed a line, and it was time to show them that I wouldn't be bullied. This was war now, and I wasn't going to lose without a fight. The more I thought about the HOA's actions, the more I realized this wasn't just a personal battle. I wasn't the only homeowner dealing with these overzealous enforcers. In fact, I started to hear more whispers from my neighbors about similar tactics: hidden fines, surprise inspections, and unreasonable demands. I knew it was time to stop being passive. If the HOA thought they could bully me into submission, they were sorely mistaken. But I also knew that going up against an organization like this alone wasn't wise. I needed to build a network to gather allies who had faced the same nonsense from the HOA. If I was going to take them down, I couldn't do it on my own. I began talking to my neighbors, starting with the ones closest to me. There was Mr. Turner, the retired lawyer down the street who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. He was one of the first people I spoke to, and as soon as I mentioned the HOA's recent visit to my property, his eyes lit up. He didn't mince words. "I've been battling them for years," he told me. "They're always looking for some tiny reason to fine you, but it's all a game. They don't have any real power unless you let them." I was relieved to find out that I wasn't alone. Mr. Turner shared stories about how the HOA had fined him for trivial issues, from the height of his grass to the color of his front door. But what struck me the most was his knowledge of the HOA's internal structure and their lack of legal authority. "They can't just do whatever they want," he said. "The HOA has to follow certain procedures and regulations. If they're violating any of those, you can challenge them." I felt a surge of hope. This was exactly what I needed to hear. I wasn't alone, and I had the law on my side. But Mr. Turner wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, I spoke to several more neighbors, all of whom had complaints about the HOA. It seemed the organization had been quietly making enemies for years, pushing people around and taking advantage of their power. There was Karen, the single mother down the block, who had been hit with a hefty fine for improperly placing her garden gnome collection in her front yard. Then there was Lucas, a young couple who had been forced to remove a trampoline from their backyard because it was considered a hazard by the HOA, despite the fact that their kids use it only on weekends. Everyone had their story, their frustration. Together, we formed a small but united front. We shared notes, compared experiences, and began researching the HOA's bylaws and the legal framework that govern their power. Mr. Turner gave me a crash course in real estate law, pointing out areas where the HOA might have overstepped its boundaries. We started looking for weaknesses, places where their rules didn't hold up legally. I also reached out to the local government and did some research about how the HOA was supposed to operate within the context of county laws. What I found was eye-opening. HOA rules were supposed to adhere to local zoning laws, and they couldn't override certain county-level regulations. It became clear that the HOA was walking a fine line, and it was only a matter of time before they crossed it. The more I learned, the more confident I became. The HOA had underestimated me, thinking I was just some passive homeowner who accept their rules without question. But now I had knowledge, and I had allies. It was time to turn the tables. The next time they came to my door, I wouldn't just be ready to defend my property. I'd be armed with facts, legal backing, and a growing network of neighbors who were fed up with being bullied. The tide was about to turn, and the HOA wouldn't know what hit them. The day came sooner than I expected. One evening, as I was finishing up work in my home office, I heard a loud knock on my door. My heart skipped a beat. I knew what it meant. When you live in a neighborhood like mine, a knock like that usually signals something unpleasant. I peeked out the window to see two figures standing on my porch, dressed in their typical HOA uniforms. They had that air of arrogance about them that sent a chill down my spine. Without missing a beat, I opened the door, greeting them with a calm but assertive tone. I had no intention of showing any fear this time. I was prepared. "Good evening, Mr. Palmer," one of them said. It was Greg, one of the higher-ups from the HOA, who had visited me earlier about the fine. He had an air of authority about him, but I wasn't about to let him intimidate me. "I've come to deliver a formal warning," Greg continued. "We've noticed several issues on your property, and unless they are resolved immediately, you'll be facing a hefty fine or further action from the HOA." My eyes narrowed. "What issues are you talking about?" He glanced at his clipboard. "First, the height of your fence exceeds the neighborhood's regulations. Secondly, we've received complaints about your property looking unkept. We've also had reports of suspicious vehicles coming and going from your driveway during late hours. These things must be addressed immediately, or else." "Or else what?" I interrupted, my voice steady but firm. "You're going to find me again. Or maybe you'll send a few more reminders like the last one." Greg seemed to bristle at my tone. He shifted his weight, adjusting his stance as if to project even more authority, but I wasn't intimidated. In fact, I could feel my confidence rising. "You'll be in violation of the community agreement," he said, trying to maintain control of the conversation. "We'll have no choice but to escalate this to eviction proceedings." My jaw tightened, and I took a deep breath. The audacity of this man. They couldn't evict me from my own property. They had no legal grounds to do so, especially with my growing understanding of their limited power. But I wasn't about to get into a shouting match with him on my doorstep. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, finally breaking the silence. "And I don't believe your HOA has the legal authority to force me out. In fact, if you'd like, we can go over the documents together. But you'll find that I'm well within my rights." Greg's smile faltered for just a second. He knew I had done my homework. But he quickly regained his composure, adjusting his jacket and shifting to a more condescending tone. "I suggest you reconsider, Mr. Palmer," he said, almost threateningly. "This is your final warning." I stood there, holding my ground. The man could threaten all he wanted, but I was no longer the scared homeowner I had been just a few weeks ago. I had done the research, I had the law on my side, and I knew my rights. "Here's the thing, Greg," I said, my voice low and serious. "You and your HO have been pushing people around for far too long. But you've picked the wrong person to mess with this time. You might have some authority in your little gated community, But the moment you step out of line, you'll find that I'm more than just a homeowner. Greg took a step back, visibly surprised by my response. It was clear that they didn't expect someone to stand up to them like this. They expected fear, compliance. But I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Consider this the last time I'll tolerate your threats, I said firmly. If you or anyone from the HOA comes to my door again with a baseless claim, I'll be taking legal action. You've been warned. I shut the door with a finality that left no room for further discussion. As I stood there, catching my breath and feeling the adrenaline still running through me, I realized this wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about standing up to an organization that thought it could bully its way into people's lives without consequence. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. My allies, the neighbors who joined my cause, had my back. The HOA may have thought they were the ones in control, but they had just made a powerful enemy. I couldn't help but smile as I walked back to my desk. The fight had only just begun, but this time I was ready. The moment I closed the door on Greg and his lackey, I felt a surge of determination coursing through my veins. There was no way in hell I was going to let these self-righteous HOA officials get away with trying to intimidate me. I'd already made it clear to them that they couldn't bully me, but now it was time to prepare for the inevitable, an all-out battle to protect my property, my rights, and my peace of mind. The first thing I did was head straight to the local records office. I knew the HOA had some legal basis to operate, but they had crossed the line by targeting me without cause. I needed to gather as much evidence as I could to prove that not only was their case weak, but that they had also been overstepping their bounds for years, using threats and intimidation to control people like me. When I arrived at the records office, I quickly scanned through the public property documents. I made copies of my deed, the bylaws of the HOA, and the legal agreements between the HOA and the community members. As I flipped through the pages, I realized something important. The HOA had been getting increasingly aggressive, but their rules weren't as ironclad as they made them out to be. In fact, some of their actions were bordering on illegal, especially when it came to the fines they imposed without following proper legal procedures. I made a mental note of the discrepancies, fully aware that the documents I was gathering would soon serve as the foundation of my defense. But I wasn't going to stop there. Next, I contacted a lawyer, a friend of mine who specialized in property law and civil rights. He'd always been a great resource whenever I had questions about my rights as a homeowner. I explained the situation to him in detail, starting with the unreasonable fines and the escalating harassment from the HOA. He was shocked by the sheer audacity of the HOA's tactics, but reassured me that I had a strong case on my side. It's clear they're trying to intimidate you into submission, he said. But from what I'm seeing, they've definitely crossed some lines. You're not alone in this fight. We'll take them down legally, step by step. I could feel the weight lift off my shoulders as he spoke. I wasn't going to face this battle on my own, and I was finally getting the professional help I needed. But there was still one thing that I had to do before we could move forward with any legal action. I needed to confront the again, this time with my lawyer by my side. Armed with the evidence I had gathered, I sent an official letter to the HOA, informing them that I would be challenging their authority and requesting a meeting to discuss the issues at hand. The letter was clear and formal, outlining the specific grievances I had with their actions, including their baseless fines and unsubstantiated threats. I also made sure to mention the discrepancies in their rules and the legal violations I had discovered. At this point, I had a sense that the HOA might be starting to feel the pressure. I was no longer the naive homeowner who would let them walk all over me. I was a force to be reckoned with, and they were going to have to deal with me on my terms. I then sent out a few emails to my neighbors who had been similarly affected by the HOA's overreach. Some of them were hesitant to get involved. After all, the HOA had a reputation for making life difficult for anyone who opposed them. But I managed to convince a few to join me in this legal battle. They shared their stories of unjust fines, unreasonable demands, and harassment from the HOA. Together, we formed a united front that was about to hit the HOA where it hurt the most, their power. By the end of the day, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The HOA may have thought they could push me around, but they didn't realize I had a network of support, the legal tools at my disposal, and most importantly, the will to stand up for what was right. It was time to turn the tables. As I sat back down at my desk, I glanced at the letter one last time before sending it off. It was the beginning of the end for the HOA's reign of terror. I knew they wouldn't take it lying down, but they had no idea what was coming. And as far as I was concerned, the fight was just getting started. The following week felt like the calm before the storm. I couldn't help but wonder how the HOA would respond to my formal letter. The days dragged on as I awaited their reaction, but when it finally came, it hit harder than I expected. I was sitting at my kitchen table one morning when I received a certified letter from the HOA. It was an official summons stating that they were filing a formal complaint against me for alleged violations of HOA regulations. They had escalated their actions quickly, seemingly in an attempt to intimidate me into backing down. But they underestimated my resolve. The letter was full of legal jargon, but it was clear they were trying to paint me as the villain in this situation. They claimed that I had ignored multiple warnings, which was, of course, a blatant lie. The HOA had never issued any official notices before this. They also cited disturbing the peace because of the community's discomfort with my outspoken behavior, which, to be honest, was probably a thinly veiled attempt to silence me. But the HOA's miscalculation was glaring. In their haste to bully me, they had forgotten to provide any real evidence to back up their claims. It was all smoke and mirrors. The letter was merely an attempt to distract me and make me think they had more power than they truly did. My lawyer, however, was quick to spot the holes in their case. As soon as I called him, we discussed our next steps. His advice was simple: don't back down. The more they push, the clearer it will be that they're in the wrong. We'll counter their accusations head-on, he said. We'll file a counter-complaint and force them to the negotiating table. But more importantly, we'll take the opportunity to expose how corrupt and flawed their system is. I felt a surge of confidence. The HOA might have been angry, but it was their anger that was now working in our favor. I was no longer just a homeowner defending my rights. I was leading the charge in exposing the HOA for what they were: abusive, power-hungry bureaucrats who had lost sight of their purpose. With my lawyer on board, we gathered our evidence and prepared to fight back. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about protecting the rights of every single homeowner in the community who had been bullied by the HOA. If the HOA thought they could intimidate me into submission, they were gravely mistaken. We took the opportunity to file a counter-complaint with the local government, highlighting the HOA's overreach and its long history of attempting to control residents unlawfully. My lawyer even suggested we bring the case to public attention, rallying support from other neighbors who had suffered in silence for far too long. The more people knew what the HOA was doing, the better. I didn't want to simply win this battle. I wanted to expose the truth. So I reached out to local news outlets and shared my story, along with the stories of my neighbors. The media was intrigued. This wasn't just a case of petty neighborhood disputes. It was a story of an overbearing HOA trying to bully residents and trample on their rights. Meanwhile, I was readying myself for the showdown. The HOA's angry letter was just the beginning. The real battle would be fought in the courts and in the court of public opinion. The HOA had underestimated me, and now they would learn just how costly their mistake had been. The day of the court hearing finally arrived, and I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I knew this wasn't just about a property dispute anymore. It was about something much bigger: my fight to retain my land, my rights, and my dignity in the face of a bureaucratic monster. The HOA had tried to intimidate me with their letters and threats, but I had spent weeks gathering evidence and building a case that would prove they were overstepping their bounds. As I walked into the courthouse, I noticed the atmosphere was tense, almost as if everyone in the room knew this was going to be a fight worth watching. My lawyer and I sat down at the defendant's table, and I took a deep breath. Across from me, the HOA's legal team looked smug. They were a group of high-priced attorneys, dressed in tailored suits, exuding an air of confidence that came from years of bullying people into submission. But today, I wasn't backing down. Today, I was ready to expose the HOA for the corrupt, power-hungry organization it truly was. The judge entered, and the courtroom quieted instantly. He was an older man with a stern face, one that suggested he had seen his fair share of petty disputes over the years. But I knew this case was different. This wasn't a simple disagreement over a fence or a tree. This was about the HOA's unchecked power and whether or not they could get away with trampling over the rights of homeowners like me. The HOA's attorneys started their argument, speaking in polished legal jargon, throwing out accusations about the supposed violations I had committed. They claimed that I had been causing disturbances in the neighborhood, refusing to abide by community standards, and that my actions were a direct threat to the HOA's ability to maintain order. I wasn't surprised by their tactics. They were trying to paint me as the villain, the troublemaker. But as their lawyers spoke, I noticed something. They didn't have any solid evidence. Their entire case was built on vague accusations and assumptions. No photos, no records, no real proof. It was clear they were trying to use their power to force me into submission without any real basis for their claims. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, feeling a surge of adrenaline. I looked directly at the judge and then at the HOA's legal team, who were clearly unprepared for what I was about to say. Your Honor, everything they've said is false. I began, my voice steady but firm. I've lived here for years, and I've never been anything but respectful to my neighbors and the community. The accusations they've made are baseless, and I have the proof to back it up. I presented the evidence we had gathered, emails, official documents, and testimonies from neighbors who were tired of the HOA's bullying. My lawyer made it clear that the HOA had overstepped its authority and had been threatening residents with unlawful fines and fees for years. We presented detailed records of the HOA's violations of its own rules, demonstrating how they had been using intimidation tactics to get their way. Then I dropped the bombshell. My ownership of the land and the way the HOA had been misusing its power to impose unlawful regulations. The judge listened intently as I laid out the facts, and I could see the expressions on the HOA's legal team start to change from confidence to concern. They had underestimated me. They thought they could bully me into submission without anyone questioning their authority. But now they were on the defensive. The judge asked a few clarifying questions, and I answered them calmly. It became clear that the HOA had no legal ground to stand on. They had been using their influence to control residents for too long, and their actions were beginning to unravel. As the hearing drew to a close, I could see that the tide had turned. The HOA's legal team knew they were losing. The judge didn't make an immediate ruling, but his body language spoke volumes. I felt a sense of victory starting to take shape, and it was almost tangible. I had come into this courtroom with nothing but my integrity, my evidence, and my determination, and now it seemed that was all I needed to win. The battle was far from over, but this was the moment I had been waiting for. The HOA was about to realize that their power had limits, and those limits had been reached. The following days after the court hearing were filled with a strange sense of anticipation. I could practically feel the chaos brewing within the HOA. The same smug confidence they once wore like armor had now turned into a frantic scramble for damage control. Their representatives called me several times, each conversation more desperate than the last. They tried to convince me to settle, to drop the case in exchange for some token concessions, but it was too late for that. They had crossed a line, and now it was my turn to be in control. The HOA was in full panic mode. They had spent years dictating the rules to the residents, using their legal power to impose fines, fees, and unreasonable demands. But now, with the legal landscape shifting under their feet, they realized they had been too aggressive, too comfortable in their unchallenged authority. For the first time in years, they were faced with someone who refused to back down and who had the means to expose them for what they were. I started receiving reports from some of the other residents. They told me that HOA representatives had been showing up at homes uninvited, trying to convince people to give up their support for me, offering promises of easier living if they just sided with the HOA's version of events. Some residents were afraid. The HOA had built a reputation over the years for making life difficult for anyone who didn't comply. But others were starting to realize that I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was standing up for everyone in the neighborhood. But as much as they tried to spin their narrative, the truth had already been laid out in the court. Their power was not as absolute as they had once believed. My lawyer told me the good news a few days later. The judge had already begun to draft his ruling, and it looked like I was going to win the case outright. The HOA, desperate to prevent a complete collapse of their authority, had no choice but to start retreating. They began quietly backing down from many of their aggressive demands. Residents who had once lived in fear of fines and retribution began reaching out to me, offering their support. People who had avoided speaking out for years now wanted to get involved, to be part of this movement to stop the HOA's iron grip on their lives. While I could feel the momentum shifting in my favor, I wasn't about to let them off the hook just yet. This wasn't going to be a quiet victory. I had the means and the will to make sure the HOA's corruption was fully exposed. I had been pushed around for far too long, and now it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. I wasn't just going to take back my land. I was going to hold them accountable for every resident they had bullied, every lie they had told, and every dollar they had stolen. As I prepared for the final showdown, I knew this wasn't going to be just a victory for me. It was going to be a victory for every single person who had ever been oppressed by the HOA. Their reign of terror was coming to an end, and I was ready to make sure the world knew just how far they had gone to maintain control. It was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down on them, and the consequences would be far worse than they ever anticipated. The day the HOA's retaliation began, I could feel the tension in the air. Their lawyers were no longer the calm, collected professionals I had dealt with before. They were now desperate, resorting to underhanded tactics, trying to stall any progress I made. I received an unexpected letter from their legal team, accusing me of having violated newly discovered HOA guidelines and threatening further legal action. They had clearly realized they were cornered and were scrambling to delay the inevitable. At first, I thought they were bluffing. After all, I had already proven my case in court, and I knew their position was weak. But their legal team didn't seem to care about the rules anymore. They were playing for time. They tried to convince the judge to delay the hearing, citing a need for more time to prepare and gather new evidence. It was nothing more than a last-ditch effort to delay the inevitable. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. My lawyer immediately filed a motion to deny their request and bring the case to a close. We had already gathered enough evidence to make our case airtight. Every email, every document, and every single piece of testimony from other residents backed up the fact that the HOA had been operating in bad faith for years. But just when I thought the worst was over, things got even uglier. The HOA's tactics shifted from legal maneuvering to intimidation. I started noticing strange cars parked near my property, unmarked vehicles with tinted windows that seemed to be watching my house at all hours. It wasn't long before I realized that these were likely hired goons, sent by the HOA to intimidate me into submission. I wasn't scared, though. I had the law on my side, and I wasn't backing down. I knew I couldn't let this slide. If the HOA thought they could scare me into dropping my fight, they were sorely mistaken. I made a plan. I gathered every piece of evidence I could to ensure they couldn't continue their illegal activities. And with the support of the local press and growing public interest, I knew I had an opportunity to not only crush their power over the neighborhood, but to expose them for what they truly were. As the days dragged on, the situation became a full-blown media circus. The HOA's reputation, once untouchable, began to erode quickly. Residents who had been too afraid to speak out started contacting the media, sharing their stories of how the HOA had mistreated them, levied outrageous fines, and enforced arbitrary rules. One by one, their dirty secrets were coming to light. Despite all the tension, I stayed focused. Every time the HOA tried to backpedal or take action against me, I fought harder. The legal battle became a war of attrition, but it was a war I was determined to win. I knew that if I could stand firm, it wouldn't just be a personal victory. It would be the end of an era of HOA tyranny. The more the HOA dug themselves into a hole, the more they exposed their desperation and corruption. They underestimated me, thinking I was just another victim they could steamroll. But I wasn't just any homeowner. I was fighting for something bigger than myself. I was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced, for every family who had been pushed around, and for every neighbor who had been made to feel inferior by a group of self-appointed overlords. This wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about taking down a corrupt system, and I wasn't going to stop until I saw it fall. The final court hearing loomed large, and the tension was palpable. Both sides had gathered their evidence, lined up their witnesses, and prepared for what would be the showdown of the century. For months, it had felt like I was fighting an uphill battle against an entire organization entrenched in power. But now, with the courtroom steps in sight, everything seemed to have come together. The strength of my case, the outpouring of support from the community, and the growing public outrage against the HOA's actions meant that this was no longer just my fight. It was a collective one. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer, prepared to face the HOA's legal team one last time. The HOA representatives, who had once seemed so untouchable, now appeared to be on the defensive. Their smug faces had faded, replaced by the unmistakable tension of a group that knew they were about to lose everything. I could see the fear in their eyes as they filed into the courtroom, their high-priced lawyers nervously reviewing their notes. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. This was it, the moment that would determine the future of my land, the HOA's fate, and ultimately the future of the neighborhood itself. The arguments began, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of confidence. We had presented an airtight case. Every legal document, every email, every piece of testimony painted a clear picture. The HOA had overstepped its bounds, violated its own rules, and engaged in illegal practices to harass and intimidate its residents. My lawyer presented our evidence calmly, methodically, while the HOA's attorneys stumbled over their words, clearly aware that they were losing ground. Every claim they made was countered with facts. Every accusation was debunked with hard proof. It became clear that the HOA's legal team had no real argument left. They had hoped to intimidate me into submission, but they had underestimated the power of truth and perseverance. As the hours dragged on, the judge grew visibly impatient with the HOA's antics. He began questioning their representatives directly, pointing out contradictions in their arguments, and calling attention to the numerous violations they had ignored for years. It was becoming painfully obvious that the HOA had no defense left. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge called a recess. The room buzzed with whispers as the courtroom emptied briefly. I walked outside, trying to steady my nerves. It was hard to shake the feeling that this was the moment of reckoning, the final turning point. I had fought so hard to get here, and now it was all in the hands of the judge. When the court reconvened, the judge delivered his ruling. The HOA had been found guilty of all charges. Their practices were deemed illegal, and the court ordered immediate restitution to all affected residents. Furthermore, the judge ordered a full audit of the HOA's financial records and operations to ensure that their corrupt practices were fully exposed. The weight of the ruling hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a monumental defeat for the HOA, a blow to the very system they had created to control, manipulate, and bully the residents into submission. The judge's decision would forever change the way they operated, and the victory was mine to savor. As the court session came to a close, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of relief. I had done it. I had taken on an organization that had bullied countless people for years, and I had won. But even more than that, I had restored hope to the community. Residents who had been afraid for years now looked to me with gratitude and respect. I had shown them that, with determination and courage, it was possible to stand up to the HOA's stranglehold. The media coverage of the case exploded in the following days. Headlines hailed the ruling as a landmark decision that could change the way homeowners associations across the country operated. The community, once divided by fear and uncertainty, was now united in triumph. And as for the HOA, they were left to pick up the pieces of their crumbling empire. Victory wasn't just about reclaiming my land. It was about standing up for what was right, about fighting for justice and for the power of the people. And now, as I looked around at the neighbors who had supported me through this long and grueling journey, I realized that the fight was about something far greater than just one person or one land. It was about the future of a community that had found its voice. The dust had barely settled when the real work began. The court ruling was a victory, yes, but it was only the beginning of a long and complex process of rebuilding. The HOA, now exposed for their illegal practices, found themselves in chaos. But as their empire crumbled, something remarkable was taking shape in the community. People who had once cowered in fear of the HOA's intimidating tactics began to stand up. The spirit of unity was contagious, and a wave of empowerment washed over the entire neighborhood. I took it upon myself to help steer this newfound momentum into something positive. The first step was restoring the trust that the HOA had long broken. I opened a series of community meetings, inviting everyone to speak out, share their concerns, and discuss ways to improve the neighborhood without the suffocating control of the HOA. It was empowering to hear people's stories of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. But it was equally heartening to see the resolve in their eyes, a collective commitment to reclaiming their homes and livelihoods. As I continued to lead these gatherings, the sense of community grew stronger. What had once been a fractured, fearful group of homeowners slowly transformed into a powerful collective of neighbors who had discovered the strength of their voice. We organized cleanup events, shared resources, and worked together to improve the neighborhood. Gone were the days of enforced conformity and paranoia. Now it was about shared values, mutual respect, and a genuine commitment to making Fairview Heights a place we could all be proud to call home. The local media continued to cover the fallout from the court ruling. Stories of how the HOA had tried to manipulate its residents and destroy livelihoods were picked up by outlets across the country. The public outcry was immense, and pressure mounted on other homeowners associations to reevaluate their practices. The case had set a precedent, and soon I began hearing from residents in other neighborhoods who had faced similar abuses. They reached out for advice, for support, and to learn how we had fought back. It was humbling, but also a reminder that the fight wasn't just about one neighborhood. It was about changing the entire culture of HOA control and corruption. With the HOA now disbanded and their financial records under investigation, the focus shifted to rebuilding the local infrastructure. It was a tough process. There was a lot of work to be done, but the spirit of cooperation that had developed made it all the more manageable. We knew that we had to set a new example, one that was centered on fairness and accountability, to ensure that no future HOA could exploit homeowners as the old one had. On a personal level, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The victory was sweet, but the real reward came in seeing the community come together and reclaim what was rightfully theirs. I no longer felt like the lone warrior fighting against an oppressive system. I had become part of something much larger, a movement of neighbors who had refused to be silenced, who had taken back control of their lives and their land. But the most satisfying part of it all was witnessing the transformation of the neighborhood. People who had once lived in fear, hiding behind closed doors, began to engage with one another. New relationships were formed. Families that had been isolated because of the HOA's draconian rules found themselves connecting in ways they hadn't before. It was like witnessing a revival, a rebirth of community spirit. As for the HOA's remnants, they faded into obscurity. Their leaders faced legal consequences, and the organization as a whole was dismantled. It was a bitter end for them, but one that was richly deserved. The residents who had once lived under their thumb no longer had to live in fear of arbitrary fines, absurd regulations, or intimidation tactics. We were free. We had won back not only our homes, but also our dignity. And so life in Fairview Heights began anew. The scars of the past would never be entirely gone, but they were no longer what defined us. What mattered now was what we were building for the future, a community where every resident had a say, where the law was followed, and where the power of the people reigned supreme. It was a long road to get here, but the journey was worth every battle fought, every injustice confronted, and every small victory that brought us closer to freedom. In the end, it wasn't just about beating the HOA. It was about something far greater, the realization that when we stand together, we have the power to reshape the world around us. And that, in itself, was the true victory.